shadows among the pine. I woke before dawn, the air sharp against my lungs as I climbed into the Blue Ridge for a morning hunt. The fog hung low, thick and grey, smothering the hills in a soft, wet silence that seemed to dull every sound, except the occasional snap of a distant branch. I had been tracking a buck the day before and thought this morning might yield the same luck. My boots crunched against frozen underbrush as I picked my way through the trees, eyes straining through the mist for any movement, any glint of antler in the dim light. I told myself it was just nerves, the forest playing tricks in the fog, but I couldn't shake the prickling sensation along my neck, the one that told me I wasn't alone. Hours passed, and the only life I saw were scattered crows clinging to gnarled branches and a few scraggly deer feeding in the distance. Then came the first snap, a sound too sharp and deliberate to belong to a deer. My pulse quickened and I froze, listening. Another snap, closer this time, but still no form revealed. I raised my rifle, scanning through the thick mist, but there was nothing. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I took a step forward, and then I saw it. Something dark, just at the periphery of my vision, slipping silently between the pines. I spun, aiming, and it vanished. The fog swallowed the space it had occupied, leaving only broken twigs and a stillness that felt unnatural, heavy, almost expectant. I pressed on, my rifle a comforting weight in my hands, but the sense of being watched didn't leave. Every rustle of leaves, every bend in the trail seemed to carry a presence just out of sight. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was a bear or another hunter, but the silence, the way it moved, didn't match anything I knew. Shadows clung to every tree trunk, and the fog thickened around me, muffling sound and distorting depth. When I paused, I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and erratic, as if the forest had tuned into it, listening, mocking. By midday, my luck had run cold. No deer, no tracks, just the endless white haze and a creeping unease that settled in my stomach like cold stones. I noticed fresh footprints near the base of a large oak, deep and wide, set apart in a gate that wasn't human. I crouched, tracing the edges with my eyes, but they didn't lead into the underbrush. Instead, they curved back toward where I had started, a loop that made no sense. I swallowed hard, feeling a tight knot in my chest, and moved on, trying to convince myself it was some hunter's trick, some oddity of the soil. The last stretch back to my truck was torture. Every shadow between the pines seemed to shift in ways my eyes couldn't track. I would glimpse movement, then nothing. A figure that stayed just beyond focus. Branches snapped again, always behind me, never ahead. I dared not call out. My voice felt too loud, too certain to draw whatever was there closer. The fog thinned slightly as I approached the clearing where my truck was parked, and relief began to trickle in, but it was bitter and tentative. I reached the truck and froze. Deep footprints surrounded the tire tracks, as though something had inspected my vehicle, wandered around it carefully, then vanished. I stepped closer, heart hammering, but there was no evidence of a person, no tracks leading away beyond the clearing. It was impossible. No one could have moved that silently, left prints like that, and disappeared into nothing. I ran my hands over the hood, over the tires, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. The fog clung to the edges of the clearing, curling around the truck like smoke, and I felt eyes on me again, from the forest, from the emptiness beyond the trees. I sat inside, locked the doors, and stared through the windshield at the tree line. The woods were still, quiet, but I knew better than to trust that calm. Hours passed. I could hear nothing, see nothing, yet the dread never lifted. It wasn't just the footprints or the figure I had glimpsed. It was the certainty that whatever had been out there had watched me, had measured me, and had decided not to make itself fully known. Something that moved in the blue ridge like a shadow, patient, deliberate, almost intelligent. Something that turned the forest into a place where instinct failed, where the air itself seemed to weigh against you. Eventually, I drove away, but the memory has stayed with me. Every ridge I pass, every foggy morning, my heart flutters at the thought of that silence. I can still picture the dark figure slipping between the pines, the way the prince circled my truck and then disappeared as if swallowed by the earth itself. Hunters talk about ghosts in the mountains, about people who vanish without a trace, but I never considered it seriously until that morning. I don't know if what I saw was human or animal, or something that simply exists in the gaps of perception, where the fog thickens and the forest becomes something else entirely. I only know that I haven't returned, and I don't intend to. Even now, years later, the thought of those silent, purposeful footsteps and the figure that vanished before I could focus on it sits at the back of my mind. The mountains are beautiful, yes, but that day taught me that they are patient, that they remember, and that the quiet is never truly empty. I still dream about the fog, about the shadow among the pines, and sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, hearing branches snap in the distance, and I swear I can feel it watching from beyond my window. The Blue Ridge holds its secrets, and I was foolish to believe I could walk among them and leave unchanged. I can't explain what I saw or why it followed me that day, but I know one thing. I walked into a hunter's nightmare, and part of it came home with me. Story 2, The Cabin That Watched Me. I arrived at the cabin just as the late afternoon sun was slipping behind the ridge, painting the trees in dull gold and shadow. The place was small, more a shed than a proper cabin, and the wood was weathered, grey and splintered, like it had endured decades of storms and cold Appalachian winters. I hadn't expected luxury, just a quiet spot to hunt, somewhere off the main trails where the deer would feel safe. Inside, the air smelled of dust, damp wood, and something faintly sour that reminded me of mouldy leaves. I shrugged it off, unpacked my gear, and settled in, thinking the isolation would be a welcome change from the clamour of the town. That first night passed quietly. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, and the creek beyond the clearing gurgled faintly, but nothing felt out of place. I slept uneasily, the floorboards groaning under the weight of the old cabin. But it was just old wood, I told myself. By morning, though, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The windows were fogged from the inside, not with condensation from the cold, but as if someone had been breathing on them, watching me in the night. I rubbed at the glass, telling myself it was impossible. No one else had been near. Still, the unease clung to me like a second skin. During the day, I went hunting, venturing deeper into the woods than I had planned. The forest was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. Birds seemed to avoid this part of the ridge. The wind itself felt hesitant, brushing over branches almost reluctantly. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder and catch the glint of movement, something that melted away whenever I looked directly. I tried to focus on deer tracks, the familiar signs of life, but the sense of being watched never left me. It wasn't the wary gaze of animals, it was something human, deliberate, almost curious, yet utterly silent. The nights grew worse. On the second evening, I lay in the rickety bed and heard it, a faint tapping, like fingernails tracing the wool behind my head. I froze, listening as the sound traced along the wooden planks, slow and methodical, as though someone were following the lines of the cabin, mapping it. I couldn't see anything. The cabin was locked, windows shut tight, yet the tapping continued for hours. Every time I moved, it would stop, then start again once I tried to settle. Sleep was impossible, and I felt every muscle tighten, every nerve on edge, as though the walls themselves were alive with attention. By the third day, my nerves were frayed. Hunting became a careful exercise in survival. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed to carry intention. I knew I wasn't alone, though there was no sign of another person. The tracks I found in the muddy soil were too small, too precise, never leading into the forest, but always curving back toward the cabin. It was as though someone or something was making rounds, circling, observing, testing me. I tried to dismiss it as the imagination, the tension of isolation, but a deep part of me recognized that this was not normal, that something had claimed this place as its own. The final night was the worst. I woke in the darkness to see shadows shifting across the walls. They moved too smoothly, too consciously, across the interior of the cabin, despite every window being tightly sealed. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up, straining to see through the dim, aware that even a slight noise might draw attention. The tapping began again, deliberate, circling, impossible to ignore. I could feel it moving around me, a pressure in the air, heavy and cold, as though the walls themselves had awareness. Panic rose, but I forced myself to stay calm, convincing myself that leaving in the dark would be worse. I spent hours in silence, listening, heart hammering. Eventually, I couldn't stand it anymore. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the old latch, and stepped out into the night. The moon was obscured by clouds, the trees black silhouettes against the faint glow of the sky. I followed the tracks, expecting them to lead into the woods, but they didn't. Instead, they circled around the cabin, weaving close enough to brush the steps I had taken. I realized then that whatever had been here hadn't fled. It had been pacing, watching, waiting, moving in tandem with me all along. I didn't wait to see more. I drove away slowly, headlights cutting through the fog, my hands gripping the wheel until they hurt. Behind me, the forest was quiet again, unremarkable. The next morning, in the light of day, I tried to rationalize everything. The fog on the windows, the shadows, the tracks. Maybe it was a hermit, a hunter, someone who had made this ridge their private world. Maybe it was just the isolation and my imagination. But I know what I felt in that cabin, what I heard in the walls, the deliberate attention that followed me in every moment of that weekend. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't coincidence. Even now, months later, I think about that place whenever I drive past the Blue Ridge. I see that cabin in my mind, battered and small, surrounded by trees that lean a little too close, and I feel the same creeping dread. I wonder if whoever, or whatever, was there is still circling, still watching, still moving silently among the pines. I haven't returned, and I never will. The memory of those nights, the subtle but insistent presence, lingers in a way that makes ordinary forests feel unsafe. Every creak, every snap of a branch, every shadow at the edge of vision brings it back. A reminder that some places in the mountains are alive in ways you can't measure or understand. And maybe that's the most terrifying thing of all, knowing that you were never alone, that someone was paying attention, and that they might still be waiting for the next unwary soul to wander in. Story 3, Whispers by the Creek. I found the creek just after sunrise, tucked into a small hollow that felt both sheltered and unnervingly exposed. The water ran clear and cold, its surface broken only by the occasional swirl of leaves or the ripple of a jumping trout. I set up my hunting stand nearby, thinking the solitude would give me a quiet morning to observe the deer. The woods were still, save for the distant call of a crow or the whisper of wind through the pines, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me. But as the day wore on, that calm began to fray. By mid-morning I noticed it first, the faintest murmur drifting on the breeze, soft and low, almost melodic. I tilted my head, trying to catch words, but they didn't make sense. At first, I told myself it was the creek itself, the sound of water over stone mimicking voices, or perhaps some distant hikers hidden by the trees. I scanned the ridges and hollows around me, rifle ready, but there was no one, nothing. Only the quiet, the creek, and the slow, almost deliberate whisper that seemed to circle me with each passing gust of wind. As the day dragged on, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. Sometimes I could swear I caught fragments of words, syllables that felt like warnings. Don't turn back, but I couldn't understand enough to be certain. My nerves tightened with every repetition. The forest felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. I moved carefully, checking the creek for tracks, scanning the underbrush for signs of life. Deer tracks were sparse, human tracks even sparser, and yet the whispers persisted, threading through the leaves in a rhythm that mirrored my own heartbeat. Around midday, I leaned over the creek to refill my water bottle, and that's when it happened. In the ripples, I saw a face, brief, pale and wrong, reflected in the water. Not mine, not any friend I'd been hunting with, and not a deer or any other animal I recognized. It was there for a heartbeat, staring up at me with an expression I couldn't identify, then gone, swallowed by the motion of the water as if it had never been. My hands shook as I lifted the bottle to my lips, and for a moment I thought I'd lost my mind. The forest was still, the wind stilled, and the only sound was the faint, almost musical whisper brushing through the trees. I tried to shake it off, told myself I'd been staring at the ripples too long, that my imagination was playing tricks after too many solitary mornings in the woods, but the unease clung to me like a shadow. Every step I took, every glance back toward the tree line, made my stomach tighten. The whispers followed me, shifting with the wind, appearing from places I hadn't been. At one point, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a blur of branches swaying, a flicker of something pale. Yet when I turned, nothing was there. It was as though the forest itself was aware of me, and not in the way of a hunter observing prey, but something far more deliberate, far more knowing. I spent the afternoon in a state of tense alertness, every sense straining. The creek, once a place of quiet solace, now felt like a trap, a focal point for attention I could neither see nor escape. Whenever I looked at the water, I half expected to see that face again, hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for me to let my guard down. By mid-afternoon, the whispers had grown almost like a current through the trees, carrying a cadence that set my nerves on edge. I stopped trying to rationalize it. I wasn't imagining it. Something was here, somewhere between the creek and the surrounding woods, and it was watching, waiting, whispering, just out of comprehension. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, shadows stretched long over the hollow. I kept my stand, hoping to catch a glimpse of deer before leaving, but I barely dared move. Each rustle of leaves, each snapping twig sounded deliberate, like footsteps pacing just beyond the line of sight. I felt a presence circling, not advancing, not retreating, just keeping pace with me. I didn't call out, I didn't dare. Every instinct in my body screamed that any noise would draw attention, and I wasn't sure attention in this case was something I wanted. By the time I finally left, carrying only an uneasy memory of a deer I never saw, the creek looked entirely ordinary. The sunlight glinted off the water, the breeze stirred the leaves, and the forest seemed perfectly still. Nothing appeared out of place, and yet I knew what I had experienced was real. The whispers, the face, the way the woods seemed conscious of my every movement. It wasn't something I could explain. I haven't returned since, and I can't imagine going back. The thought of that hollow, of the creek, of the shadows that seem to mirror mine, makes my skin crawl even now. Sometimes, when I'm hiking closer to home, I swear I hear it again. A low murmur carried by the wind, faint enough to doubt, melodic enough to unnerve. And when the water in a stream or creek ripples at just the right angle, I catch a glimpse of something familiar in the reflection. A pale, brief outline of a face, just enough to make me drop my gaze and keep moving. I know the forest isn't empty, not ever, and I know there are places, quiet and still, where being watched is unavoidable. The experience left me uneasy in ways I can't fully explain. I see the Blue Ridge differently now, with a lingering suspicion that somewhere, unseen, the woods remember every step, every breath, every solitary hunter who dares to wander through. And I carry the memory of that creek like a stone in my chest, a weight that sits with me, quiet but insistent. I can't tell if what I saw that day was human or some distorted reflection of the forest itself, but I know this. The moment I glimpsed that face, I felt the true presence of something patient, something deliberate, something waiting just beyond the veil of comprehension. Even now, years later, I think about that hollow and the creek, and I feel that same tension rise in me, the awareness that I wasn't alone, that something followed my every step, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I don't know if anyone else has noticed it, if anyone else has been aware of those murmurs in the trees. But I do, and I never want to return, because the moment you know the forest is listening, the moment you glimpse that quiet presence in the reflection of the water, the solitude you once sought becomes a suffocating weight, and the world you thought you knew becomes something else entirely. Story 4. The Trail That Disappeared. I set out early that morning, the sun just brushing the ridges with pale light, hoping to catch a glimpse of deer before the heat of the day made them retreat into thicker cover. I had hiked this area a few times before, but today I noticed a faint trail leading deeper into the woods, narrow and almost hidden under fallen leaves. It felt familiar, as though I'd been here before, but the trail didn't appear on any map I had. I shrugged, thinking maybe it was a route an old hunter had worn down over the years. I followed it, boots crunching on loose pine needles, and at first it seemed ordinary enough, just another ridge, just another quiet morning in the Blue Ridge. As I went deeper, the forest thickened, and the path seemed to stretch endlessly. The trees leaned in closer, branches clawing at each other and brushing my shoulders as I passed. I reached for my compass, but it spun uselessly in my hand like it had no allegiance to the earth beneath my feet. My stomach tightened. I had been hiking long enough to know the woods, to trust my instincts, and something about this place felt off. Shadows clung to the corners of my vision, shifting just as I tried to focus. Every so often, I noticed boot prints in the dirt, prints that weren't mine, too large, too deliberate. But when I glanced around, there was no one there, no sound, no movement, only the forest and the slow, deliberate rhythm of my own footsteps. I called out, expecting a friend or another hunter who might be wandering these remote ridges, but my voice returned to me in the form of an echo, swallowed almost immediately by the dense woods. There was no answer, no distant shout, nothing but the echo. The forest felt patient and observant, like it was testing me, gauging my presence. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but my rationalizations kept slipping away with every turn of the trail. The path twisted unnaturally, bending back on itself in ways that didn't make sense. A rise here led me to the same grove I had passed 10 minutes ago. A stream I swore I crossed before appeared again, glinting in the same light, as though the forest had folded over itself while I wasn't looking. Hours passed, and my unease grew. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and yet I couldn't find the trail's end. Every time I tried to backtrack, I would find myself facing the same grove, the same rock outcropping, the same fallen log I had paused at before. It wasn't the normal confusion of the forest, not the kind that comes from poor map reading or a wandering compass. It felt deliberate, almost conscious. I had the sense that I was being guided, not outward, but inward, towards something I couldn't name. My heart thumped in my chest with each step, a tight, anxious rhythm that seemed to echo off the trunks and twist along the path ahead. The shadows grew heavier as the sun dipped lower, lengthening across the trail like dark fingers. Noticed more prints in the dirt now, faint and half obscured, always trailing beside me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, but never leaving the circular pattern of the forest floor. I stopped several times, crouched low, straining to catch any sound of movement. All I could hear was the wind rustling through the high branches, the distant call of a crow, the soft echo of my own laboured breathing. Something was there, I was certain, just out of sight, moving in tandem with me through the trees. Finally, exhausted, I stumbled forward, trying to keep bearings, trying to remember landmarks. The trail curved sharply around a stand of pines, and for a moment I thought I could see the ridge beyond. But when I emerged from the thick trees, there was nothing, no trail, no indication that anyone had passed through at all. The forest floor was pristine, undisturbed, as if the path I had walked didn't exist. I ran my hand along a mossy rock, hoping for some anchor, some evidence that I hadn't been hallucinating, and found nothing. Every tree, every bush, every rock was exactly as it would have been if I had never been there. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. It was quiet, peaceful even, in the way the mountains can feel at dusk. But I knew better. I knew that something had led me in circles, had guided my steps, and had left no trace for me to prove it. My chest heaved with exhaustion and fear, and a chill ran down my spine. I stumbled the last distance back to my truck as the light faded completely, the forest darkening into blackness. The moment I reached the clearing, the familiar sight of the truck glinting in the last light of day, relief washed over me, but it was tentative, fragile. I had escaped the trail, but I couldn't shake the sense that the forest had followed me, that it had marked me, and that it would remember every step I had taken. Even now, thinking back, I can feel that oppressive quiet of the Blue Ridge surrounding me, the trail that disappeared, the shifting shadows, the spinning compass, and the prints that weren't mine. These are not memories that fade. They sit in my mind like loose stones in my chest, shifting and uneasy. I never spoke of it to anyone, because who would believe that a trail could vanish, that the forest could bend in on itself, that something could guide you so subtly that you only realize its presence once it is done with you. I never return to that ridge, but sometimes when I'm hiking in other parts of the mountains, I feel it again, the sense of unseen observation, of being carefully shepherded by something beyond comprehension, something patient and deliberate. The woods have a memory, and that day I became part of it, whether I wanted to or not. I don't know what I saw or what followed me through that forest, but I know it exists in the spaces between trees, in the shadowed curves of forgotten trails, and in the echo of footsteps that never belonged to me. I can only hope that it is as indifferent now as it was then, and that it hasn't claimed anyone else as it claimed me. Still, every so often, late at night, or in quiet moments on a ridge, I think of that trail, and a shiver runs through me. I know it's out there, waiting, circling, patient, and that the forest keeps its secrets in ways the mind can barely comprehend. Story 5, Blood in the Thicket. I had set out that morning with nothing more than my rifle, a pack of provisions, and the stubborn hope of bagging a deer before the sun disappeared behind the ridge. The forest was damp with early morning mist, each breath filling my lungs with the earthy, almost metallic scent of the Appalachian undergrowth. I followed a narrow game trail, careful not to disturb the thick layer of moss and fallen leaves underfoot. Birds called occasionally, their songs echoing between the ridges, but for the most part, the woods were silent, holding their secrets tightly. I was alone, and I liked it that way, until the scent hit me, sharp and unmistakable. Iron. I froze mid-step, sniffing the air, trying to tell myself it was just a deer, perhaps a wounded one, leaving a trace of blood from a previous hunter's shot, but there was no mistaking it. The tang of blood was fresh and heavy, curling into my nostrils like smoke. I followed the smell cautiously, each footstep measured, eyes scanning the forest floor for any clue, a broken branch, a disturbed patch of earth, tracks in the mud, but there was nothing. Then I saw it, a smear of deep red across moss-covered rocks, vivid against the green. My stomach twisted with unease. I knelt, examining the streak, half expecting to see the trail continue toward an injured deer, but the blood seemed to dissolve into the earth, vanishing after a few feet. No tracks, no fur, no broken twigs. It was as if the forest itself had been bleeding, or as if something wanted me to see it, to notice, and to follow. I felt a cold sweat prickling along my spine, and I gripped my rifle tighter, the wooden stock suddenly heavy and uncomfortable in my hands. I called out, thinking perhaps another hunter had passed this way, maybe wounded. My voice cracked against the trees, and all that answered me was silence. The forest did not carry my sound. It swallowed it whole. And then I heard it, the faintest rasp of breathing behind me. I spun, heart hammering, rifle raised. Shadows flickered between the trees, shifting unnaturally, too fast, too smooth. My eyes darted from one dark shape to another, but there was nothing concrete, nothing that belonged in this world. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I moved forward, following the smear of blood as though compelled by some unspoken force. My boots sank into damp moss, and the scent grew stronger, almost suffocating. I could feel it on my skin, in my hair, like the air itself was soaked with it. And yet, the trail never led anywhere. No carcass, no wound, nothing but empty thickets and twisted roots. Every time I paused, every time I listened, I thought I could hear that slow, deliberate breathing again, just beyond the edge of my vision. I dared not turn my back. I dared not call out. My fingers ached from holding my rifle, and my throat had gone dry from the tension. By midday the sun had climbed high, but its light did nothing to reassure me. The shadows under the trees seemed thicker now, the air heavier. Each step felt like moving through water, slow and resistant, as though the forest itself wanted me to stay, wanted me to see something I could not. And then I saw movement, an impossible blur darting between the trees, so quick I could only catch glimpses. A shape, humanoid, yet wrong, too fluid, almost liquid in its motion. I raised my rifle, fired once, and heard the hollow echo swallowed by the mountains. When I looked again, there was nothing. Not a trace, not a whisper. Only the blood, faint now, as if it had been a mirage all along. Hours passed. I felt the forest pressing in around me, the sunlight waning, shadows lengthening into grotesque shapes that seemed to follow me. The smell of iron was still there, subtle but persistent, and I began to feel it everywhere, the metallic tang in my mouth, on my hands, even in the sweat rolling down my neck. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, paranoia from solitude, but I knew better. Something had been here, something human, and yet utterly alien, stalking me in the spaces between trees and the quiet pauses of the wind. When night fell, I tried to find my way back to the truck, but the forest seemed different now, distorted, unfamiliar. Every ridge looked the same, every tree a mirror of another, every shadow a hint of something watching. My compass spun lazily, useless, as if the magnetic pull itself had been disrupted by the presence of whatever had trailed me. And the blood, the trail I had followed so blindly, was gone. Not a smear, not a drop, not a clue to explain the fear that had rooted itself in my chest. I stumbled blindly, calling out again, and only the echoes returned, warped and distorted, as if the forest were mocking me. I finally emerged onto a faint clearing, my legs shaking, heart hammering so violently I thought it might burst through my ribs. The truck was there, unchanged, innocent, parked in the soft mud where I had left it that morning. I ran to it, fumbling with the keys, desperate for light, for warmth, for some reminder that the world was real and not some fevered nightmare. And yet, as I glanced back toward the tree line, I swore I saw a shadow lingering just beyond the clearing, watching, patient, unhurried. I slammed the door and started the engine, tires spinning in the wet mud, and drove as fast as the rutted road would allow, never daring to look back. Even now, weeks later, the memory haunts me. The scent of iron returns unbidden in the damp corners of my basement, when I walk past mossy stones in the woods behind my house, in the quiet moments before sleep. Sometimes I wake, sweating, hearing that impossible breathing, that soft dragging of feet that weren't mine. I cannot explain what I saw, what followed me, or why the blood appeared and disappeared with such cruel precision. I tell myself it was the solitude playing tricks, the long hours alone in the Appalachian woods, the stories of lost hunters and strange vanishings. But I know deep in my bones that there was something there, something patient and deliberate, something that had marked me without leaving evidence, something that would always be waiting in the shadows if I ever returned. I never have gone back. The trail I followed does not exist on maps, in memory, or in any logical sense. Friends scoff at my story, suggesting stress, imagination, or coincidence. But the smell, the sound, the feeling of being tracked, it lingers, tangible, like a bruise on the back of my mind. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still dream of the forest, of the smear of blood across rocks that led nowhere, of eyes just beyond the trees that never blinked, never looked away, and never left me alone. It's there, waiting, patient, and I know if I were foolish enough to follow it again, I would vanish in the quiet, unremarkable terror of a trail that should not exist, in a forest that keeps its secrets well, and in a shadow that never truly leaves. Story 6 echoes from the hunting blind. I climbed into my blind before the first hint of dawn, the world outside still pressed in shadow and mist. The smell of wet earth and pine was thick, grounding me to the ridge where I'd parked my truck hours earlier. I had planned for a quiet day, maybe a deer or two, nothing more than the usual solitude I craved out here in the hollows. The air was brittle and cold, brushing against my face through the mesh windows of the blind, carrying with it a faint scent of something damp, moss, rot, and something I couldn't name. I settled in, arranging my gear, listening to the creek far below, letting the forest sounds lull me into focus. Hours passed in a rhythm I knew well, a deer rustling in the underbrush, the snap of a twig, the occasional flutter of a bird startled from its perch. Nothing unusual, at least until I heard it, the tapping. At first I thought it was the wind, rattling the blind's wooden frame. But it wasn't random. It was measured, deliberate, almost musical in its pacing. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. It seemed to follow the beat of my own heart, a strange, uncanny echo of the pulse that had quickened in my chest. I called out a simple, "Hello?" letting my voice slip into the mist, expecting maybe a neighbour hunter or some local kid testing his own nerve. Silence answered me. The tapping persisted, now faster, then slower, like it had noticed my hesitation, my unease. I gripped my rifle tighter, eyes darting to the edges of the blind, trying to catch some sign of movement in the trees, the fog, anything, nothing. By mid-morning, the sun had crept higher, dissolving the last of the mist, yet the tapping didn't stop. I sat frozen, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a raccoon or a squirrel, some animal scaling the side of the blind for food. But the rhythm, it was too precise, too intentional. I could almost swear it was counting my breaths, measuring my fear. I whispered to myself, telling myself I was imagining things. I had been out here plenty of times, alone, with nothing more than the forest around me. Yet this felt different. The air had weight now, thick and pressing. I could feel eyes, though I knew the woods were empty. Around noon, I decided I had to check the area to make sense of it. I climbed down carefully, boots crunching softly against the dry leaves and fallen branches, rifle ready. The ground around the blind looked normal at first, disturbed only by my own footprints. But then I saw them. Tracks, too small, too perfect. Tiny impressions in the dirt, like little human hands pacing in circles. I knelt, studying them, my stomach tightening as my mind fought for explanations. No animal made prints like these. No child had been wandering these ridges. I would have noticed. The tracks formed loops around the blind, circling and circling as if someone, or something, had been standing there the whole morning, waiting, watching. I followed the prints for a few steps, half expecting them to vanish like a trick of the mud. But they didn't. They led to the edge of the thicket and then stopped abruptly, fading into the undergrowth as if whoever made them had simply disappeared. The tapping resumed then, louder now, closer, echoing from every direction at once. I spun slowly, rifle raised, heart hammering, trying to locate its source. It felt as if the sound had taken on a physical form, pressing in around me, tracing my every movement. I called out again, voice sharper this time. "Who's there?" Nothing but the echo. Hours passed in a haze of tension, every crack of a twig, every sigh of the wind amplifying my fear. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone, that something had learned my patterns, my hesitations. The blind, once a place of solitude, had become a trap. I circled it, inspecting the area for signs of entry or exit, trying to make sense of the impossible. But there was no sign of any intruder, no footprints beyond those small, unnerving impressions. Nothing tangible to explain what I had seen, heard, or felt. My hands itched, cold sweat forming in the hollows of my neck, every nerve screaming that I should leave. But my pride and stubbornness kept me tethered to the ridge, to the spot that had once promised peace. By late afternoon, the sun had shifted, shadows lengthening across the forest floor, making the tracks look more sinister, the trees like towering, looming shapes. I climbed back into the blind reluctantly, the tapping resuming almost immediately, softer now, teasing, almost taunting. I pressed myself into the corner, trying to convince myself it was nothing, imagining squirrels or woodpeckers, letting my mind cling to rational explanations. But deep down, I knew better. This was the kind of thing you can't rationalize, the kind of thing that leaves a mark on the way your chest tightens, on the way your ears strain for the next sound long after it has stopped. Even as I packed up to leave that evening, the unease stayed with me. The forest seemed quieter now, but the memory of that tapping followed me with every step. I traced my way back to the truck slowly, eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the periphery. I kept glancing back at the blind, half expecting to see something staring back at me, and part of me hoped I wouldn't. I drove home with windows rolled up, engine thrumming in the quiet Appalachian night. Yet I felt like the blind had followed me, its tapping rhythm now embedded in my own heartbeat. I haven't returned to that ridge since. I hunt closer to home, in fields I know, in woods I can trace with my eyes and compass. But sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I hear it again. A faint tap, 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 carried across the hollers, soft, deliberate, like a warning or a reminder. I never see it, never know where it comes from, yet I feel it. That sound waits for the careless, for the curious, for anyone who dares to wander where the forest has its own rules. And though I try to tell myself it's nothing, I can't shake the certainty that it remembers me, that it knows I heard it, and that it's still out there, circling, waiting. Even now, months later, I feel a prickling at the back of my neck when I think about that day. A faint echo in my ears that isn't in the real world, but feels as real as the forest itself. I try not to think about it too long, but it lingers, a persistent memory I can't erase. That blind, that ridge, the endless tapping, it changed the way I move through the woods, the way I hear the wind in the pines, the way I trust silence. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and I'm alone, I swear I hear it again, tapping just beyond reach, as if reminding me that some parts of the forest are meant to be left alone. Some sounds are meant to follow you forever, and some eyes are always watching, even when you think you're safe. Story 7. The Vanishing Buck. I'd been hunting these ridges for years, the kind of long, drawn-out solitude that chews at a man's patience and makes him part of the forest in ways outsiders can't understand. That morning the air was crisp, the kind of clear blue sky that promises a good day in the mountains, and I spotted him almost immediately. A buck larger than any I'd seen in a lifetime. His antlers were wide, majestic, stretching like the branches of the oaks that lined the ridge, and for a moment I felt a sharp thrill that was half awe, half fear. I raised my rifle slowly, careful not to startle him, heart hammering in that peculiar rhythm hunters know when adrenaline meets reverence. Every step, every rustle of leaves beneath my boots felt magnified. Even the distant cry of a crow sounded like it was inside my chest. I aimed, held my breath, and squeezed the trigger, but the crack of the shot never met him. In the time it takes for a heartbeat to pass, he was gone. No sudden crash through underbrush, no flurry of movement, just gone. I froze, rifle still raised, scanning the slope and the trees, and the first sense of unease settled over me. The snow-dusted dirt below his hooves, the tracks I had been following for nearly an hour, stopped dead at a bare patch of earth. They didn't fade, they didn't vanish into brush. They ended as if the ridge had simply swallowed him whole. I lowered the rifle slowly, my mind racing and refusing to accept the rational explanation. Deer don't disappear like that. Not even in these old, deep Appalachian woods, and certainly not one that size. I started down the trail, retracing the tracks, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe a hollow underbrush that I'd missed, but nothing explained it. Every footprint led to nothing. I knelt in the dirt, touching the ground where his hooves should have pressed into the earth, and there was nothing but moss and soil, soft and undisturbed. The silence pressed in, heavy and unyielding. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then, somewhere in the distance, I felt it, the faintest sensation of eyes on me. Not the deer's eyes, not the kind you'd expect from an animal startled and fleeing, but deliberate, calculating, observing. I called out, my voice echoing across the ridges, cracking against the pines. But there was no answer, only the whisper of leaves and the sighing of the wind through the ridge. My heart thumped so hard I could feel it in my throat, my palms slick against the rifle. I tried to shake it off, rationalize it. Nerves, the solitude, the long hours of hunting alone. But as I climbed higher onto the next ridge, I began to notice subtle things that didn't belong. Broken branches that looked recent but bore no sign of struggle, tufts of fur that didn't match the local deer, a shadow that moved just beyond my peripheral vision and vanished whenever I tried to look directly. Hours passed in a blur. I tracked, searched, and climbed, but the forest offered nothing. The buck's tracks didn't resume, didn't curl back into some hidden grove. They simply weren't there. And yet the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every snap of a twig underfoot felt amplified. Every bird call sounded like a signal, a warning. The sun dipped low, staining the sky a bruised orange, and I realized I hadn't eaten, hadn't even noticed time passing. My breath came quick, visible in the cold, and I wondered, not for the first time, if maybe the legends the old hunters spoke of, the vanishing buck, the ridge that leads men astray, were more than stories meant to scare kids. By evening, I found myself on a small plateau, looking down at the ridge I had climbed hours before. The landscape was familiar, impossibly so, and yet entirely alien. It was as if the forest had shifted behind me while I wasn't looking. I could see the faint outline of the ridges I knew, but the path back to my truck, the trail I had taken countless times before, was gone. The ground seemed unbroken, untouched by human or animal alike, and a chill seeped into my bones. I couldn't explain it. My rational mind screamed at me to turn back, to accept that maybe I'd lost my bearings, but a deeper, older part of me, the part that understood the mountains in ways words couldn't capture, knew I hadn't. Something had been here, and it had been waiting. As darkness settled, the forest around me began to take on a different character. Shadows stretched in impossible angles, trees leaning in ways that made my stomach tighten. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell of musk and something metallic, like blood or rust. I felt drawn to it, an instinctive tug in my chest, and I knew the ridge hadn't given up its secret. I stood there, rifle raised, straining to see, and for just a second I thought I saw movement, a flicker of brown and white in the corner of my eye. I spun, heart hammering, but there was nothing, only the forest, vast and silent. I stumbled back down the ridge as twilight surrendered to night, every sense straining, every nerve screaming. By the time I reached the hollow where I'd parked my truck, my hands were shaking, and the cold sweat on my neck had soaked through my shirt. I looked at the spot where the tracks had begun, half expecting to see them resume, to see that the buck had returned, waiting as if to mock me. But there was nothing. Not a hoof print, not a broken twig, not a hint that anything had been there at all. Just the undisturbed forest, endless and indifferent. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake it. I walk those ridges closer to home, the trails I know like the backs of my hands, and sometimes I swear I see him. Just a glimpse, a flicker in the brush, the weight of those antlers in my peripheral vision. Sometimes I feel eyes on me in the woods behind my cabin, a sense of being watched, tracked, catalogued in ways that make no sense. I tell myself it's memory, nerves, maybe even hallucination brought on by too many mornings alone in the cold. But then I hear the snap of a branch, subtle and precise, just outside the light of the porch, and I freeze, knowing in a way I cannot explain that the ridge, the buck, the woods themselves remember me. I've tried to tell others, friends who hunt, men who swear they've seen the old legends come alive, but they nod politely, chuckle, and dismiss it. They haven't felt the forest close in like I have, haven't seen the tracks end in air, haven't felt the weight of something waiting in the woods. I don't expect them to understand. I don't even fully understand it myself. There's a hollowness in the ridge now, a tension that hums under the pines, and when I lie awake at night, I swear I can hear hooves, light against the dirt, just beyond hearing, pacing in rhythm with my own pulse. I don't go back to that ridge. I haven't hunted there since, and I probably never will, but the memory lingers, sharp and cold. The buck's eyes, if they were eyes at all, seem to follow me still, a judgment I cannot explain. And in the quietest moments, when the wind shifts just right through the trees, I feel the ridge calling, as though it's never let me leave, as though it waits for me to stumble once more into its hollow and vanish, like so many things in the forest are said to do. I carry the unease with me, in my chest, in my hands, in the hollow rhythm of every heartbeat. I don't know if it was a deer, or something older, or something I'll never name, but I know it watched me, and somehow, in ways I cannot prove, it still does. Story 8, Footsteps in the Fog. I remember that morning like it was etched into my bones, a fog rolling over the ridge thick enough to swallow the world whole. I had left before dawn, boots crunching through frost-hardened leaves, my breath pluming in the icy air, expecting the quiet solitude that always made the early hunts bearable. The mist curled around the trees, hanging low in the hollows, muffling everything except my own careful steps. It felt like the mountains had drawn a veil across themselves, and for a while, I welcomed it. There's a certain comfort in being alone with your own thoughts, rifle in hand, the world reduced to shapes and shades of grey. But the comfort didn't last. It began with a sound so slight I almost ignored it, a soft, measured crunch, like another boot on the same path I was following. I froze mid-step, rifle lifting without thought, straining my ears. There it was again, deliberate, patient, keeping pace with me but never drawing closer. At first, I thought it might be another hunter, maybe one of the locals who like these early morning trails. "Hello," I called, my voice cutting through the damp fog, sharp and unsteady. Silence answered, thick and almost liquid, pressing into my ears. I started walking again, slower this time, eyes darting between the grey outlines of trees, trying to catch a shape, a movement, something familiar. The sound followed, never faltering, never wavering. Every time I stopped, the footsteps stopped. Every time I moved, they moved. My pulse quickened, not just with fear, but with that slow, gnawing unease that something was watching me for reasons I couldn't understand. The fog made everything feel unreal, like I was drifting through a dream, and yet the sound was insistently real. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. The forest was a labyrinth of grey and black, the mist twisting around trunks, clinging to ferns, and hiding the familiar paths beneath a blanket of silence. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that my own footsteps had echoed or that some critter had fallen into the path behind me. But the rhythm was too precise, too human. I could feel it in the space between my own heartbeat and the phantom steps that mirrored it perfectly. I veered off the path, trying to test my suspicion, circling back, crouching behind a ridge to see if anything revealed itself. Nothing. Only the fog, the trees, the muffled sound of my own boots pressing into damp earth. I thought of turning back, heading for the old logging road, the one that would take me out to the truck parked at the edge of the forest. But the sound had me rooted, a weight pressing at my chest, urging me forward, yet warning me to stop. By the time I reached the old oak clearing where the path opened toward the truck, the fog had thickened even more, a grey so dense it seemed almost solid. And then I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they belonged to the mysterious companion or predator whose steps had haunted me, but there were none. Not a single mark disturbed the damp leaves, not even the faintest indentation. The earth was untouched, smooth and unbroken, as if the forest had never known another person had passed through it. I looked around, my rifle trembling in my hands, scanning the mist for some clue, some hint of what had stalked me, but there was nothing. Nothing that could be seen or heard except the echo of the footsteps that had followed me, now fading in the distance, leaving only the oppressive silence and the lingering fog. I tried to rationalize it. Tricks of the mind, overactive nerves, the kind of thing that happens when you're isolated in the woods too long. But rational thought didn't settle the unease in my chest. It only deepened it. I walked faster, almost running now, the ridge rolling beneath my feet, the fog curling around my ankles like it was alive. I could feel the cold sweat on my back, my hands gripping the rifle tighter, knuckles white. Every shadow seemed to twitch. Every sound, from the distant rustle of leaves to the snap of a twig, made me jerk in alarm, and always in that half-formed space between fear and disbelief. I could feel it again, the presence just behind, just out of sight, a rhythm that matched mine too perfectly to be coincidence. When I finally burst through the last stand of pines and saw the truck, relief should have washed over me. It didn't. The door was locked, keys in my pocket, but the fog had thinned just enough to reveal the clearing around it. And then I saw the ground, smooth, unbroken. No tracks led to the truck. Not a single imprint marked the earth except the ones I'd made. I sank onto the tailgate, trying to catch my breath, telling myself it was over, that whatever had followed me had given up, had melted back into the forest. But the unease didn't fade. Even as I started the engine and drove down the winding gravel road, the rhythm haunted me. In the quiet of my own cabin later that night, I could almost hear it again, faint and deliberate, pacing just outside, keeping time with my heartbeat. The forest was miles away, but the sound clung to me, a ghost of the morning that refused to release its grip. I thought I had escaped, but the impression lingered, heavier than any footprint, more insistent than any shadow. It's been weeks since that morning, and I haven't returned to that ridge. I hunt closer to home now, in fields I know, in woods that feel familiar. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the mist gathers low over the hollows, I swear I hear it. That quiet tapping, that echoing pace, the invisible companion who mirrors my steps. I check the ground, scanning for footprints, for any sign that someone or something has been there. And every time, there is nothing. Just the earth, smooth and untouched, and the slow, steady echo of steps that vanish before I can make sense of them. I've told a few friends about it, but most dismiss it. Fog, nerves, imagination. Maybe they're right. Maybe I just lost my mind for a morning in the mountains. But I can't shake the feeling that it was real, that I wasn't alone, and that whatever it was, it knew the woods better than I ever could. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself holding my breath, listening for a rhythm that isn't there, afraid that the echo might return to claim me when I least expect it. The ridge is quiet now, or at least it seems quiet, but I know better. Some things in the mountains aren't meant to be found, and some steps, once heard, never truly fade. Story 9, the old tree that watched. I had been hunting that ridge for years, always alone, always careful to move quietly and respect the rhythms of the forest. That morning, I found myself drawn to a massive oak that I had passed countless times, but never truly noticed. Its trunk was broad enough to rest my back against, and the way its gnarled roots twisted into the earth gave it a weight, a presence that felt almost alive. I leaned there, rifle across my knees, scanning the brush for any movement, yet the woods were impossibly still. Even the wind seemed hesitant, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The kind of quiet that usually comforts a hunter instead settled into my chest like a heavy stone, pressing against my ribs. I waited, telling myself the deer would come, that patience always paid off. Hours passed, sunlight spilling in long golden slants through the canopy, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the oak was watching me, that it held some hollow awareness in its towering bulk. The shadows beneath its limbs clung unnaturally, sharper and darker than the rest of the forest floor. At first, I blamed my imagination. Long hours of isolation do strange things, but there was a rhythm to those shadows, like they shifted in deliberate movements. I noticed a subtle change each time I blinked or shifted my weight, a slow crawling of darkness along the bark that I couldn't explain. Curiosity overpowered fear, and I stepped closer, letting my fingers trace the rough bark. That's when I saw them, faint carvings, partially obscured by moss and lichen, etched deep into the oak's skin. Names, dates, symbols that made no sense to me. Some were old, decades at least, while others seemed fresh, the cuts still raw, almost bleeding from the tree's sap. The realization that people had come here before me, leaving their marks, made a chill run down my spine. I wondered if they had known what I was starting to feel, the pressure of being observed, the subtle sway of the air around the trunk. Though there was no wind at all, I moved around the tree slowly, examining each carving, and that's when I heard it, a faint creak, like wood bending, almost a groan, coming from the canopy above. I froze, every nerve taut, and the forest swallowed my breathing in its oppressive quiet. Seconds stretched into minutes. The air felt thick, heavy with a presence I couldn't identify, something that had lingered in the forest long before I arrived and seemed unwilling to leave. My hand, which had been steady on the rifle, shook as I held it closer, eyes darting to every shadow that stretched from the oak's immense trunk. By late afternoon, I had convinced myself I needed to leave, that I'd lingered too long in an empty ridge. I backed away from the tree, slowly at first, then briskly, but the forest seemed to stretch, elongating the path in front of me. I couldn't see any movement, yet the feeling of being followed intensified, a subtle pressure brushing the back of my neck. I looked back once, and though there was nothing there, the oak's shadow seemed to lean toward me, reaching, pressing, and my stomach clenched as if the tree had its own intent. I returned to my cabin that evening with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. The woods, which had always felt like a second skin, felt alien, distant, as if they had decided to exclude me from some hidden order I didn't belong to. Sleep did not come easily, the memory of the carvings and the oppressive gaze of the oak lingering in the corners of my mind. When I finally drifted into a fitful slumber, the dreams were vivid and suffocating. I saw the tree leaning over me, its bark alive with writhing shadows, the carvings glowing faintly, names and symbols twisting into shapes I couldn't recognize. The roots moved like fingers, reaching, grasping, and I woke in a cold sweat, heart hammering, ears straining for sounds that weren't there. Morning light came weakly through the cabin window, and the unease of the night did not lift. I stepped outside, forcing myself to breathe the crisp air, to remind myself that I was back in the ordinary world. My truck, parked just beyond the porch, gleamed as usual in the early sun, yet as I approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh scratches lined the hood and roof, deep gouges that pointed back toward the ridge I had left behind. They were deliberate, careful, and possibly precise, too long to have been done by an animal, too random to be a simple accident. My hands shook as I ran my fingers over the gouges, each one seeming to hum with a quiet menace, a reminder that whatever watched me from that oak had not left with the sunset. I returned to the ridge once more, under the pretense of hunting, though every instinct screamed against it. The carvings were still there, faintly glinting in the dappled light, and the shadows clung as if alive. I noticed something new this time. Small, shallow indentations around the base of the oak, circular and rhythmic, almost like the land had been pressed by unseen hands. I stepped carefully, trying to rationalize, telling myself it was roots, erosion, old animal tracks, but my heart knew better. I felt the gaze of the oak more acutely than ever, heavy and patient, waiting for me to understand something I could not. Over the following weeks, I tried to ignore it, hunting closer to home, avoiding the ridge. Yet the forest seemed to follow me with memory, the shadows of that oak lingering in peripheral glimpses of the woods, in the bends of streams, in the corners of my vision when I least expected it. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind stirs the trees just right, I hear it again, the subtle creak of bark, the faint scrape of something moving, deliberate, watching. I tell myself I imagine it, that the mind plays tricks on a man alone in the woods, but deep down, I know I carry a part of that ridge with me, and it carries a part of me back. I haven't returned to that oak since that first day. I've learned to respect the boundaries of the forest, to listen and to fear in equal measure. Yet I cannot forget the weight of its presence, the carvings, the shadows, or the scratches that waited for me at the cabin. Sometimes, when I pass through other ridges or wander deeper into the hills, I catch myself glancing at massive oaks, listening for creaks, searching for shadows that cling too tightly. The memory of that day lingers in my chest, a pressure I cannot shake, a quiet horror that refuses to release its grip. The forest is patient, and whatever watches through the hollow eyes of those old trees does not forgive or forget, and neither do I. I cannot explain it, and I suspect I never will. But every time I hear the faint groan of an old oak, or see the shadows twist unnaturally along its trunk, my hands tighten around whatever I have at hand, and I am reminded that some things in the Appalachians are older than any man's understanding. They wait, they watch, and sometimes they leave a mark, just subtle enough that you wonder whether it was real or whether the forest itself is whispering a warning too late to heed. And I know that in some way, that oak is still leaning over me from miles away, patient, eternal, watching.